need to know about fractions. Fractions, what's that? Lights, camera, action. I teach you everything you need to know about fractions. Fractions, everything you need to know about fractions.
Hello and welcome to the Kearney Math Show. Thank you all for tuning in today. On today's episode of the Kearney Math Show, we are going to be featuring adding and subtracting fractions and mixed numbers. So before we get started, take a moment to escriba tu nombre en tu papel, write your name on your paper and the entry. And this is going to be entry number 10. So take a moment to write entry number 10. So before we get started, let's just go over what our learning goals are so we know kind of by the end of this video where we should be. So by the end of the video, I want you to be able to explain to someone else how to add and subtract fractions and mixed numbers with an emphasis that they are both positive and negative. You guys have been adding and subtracting fractions and mixed numbers probably for several years. The difference with this year is we're dealing with positive and negative fractions. And then eventually we're going to be solving some word problems involving fractions. Okay, so we're going to just do a little bit of review and some back work before we get to the steps. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take a moment to review something really important called the least common multiple. So take a second to think back, and does anyone remember how to find the least common multiple? Okay, the least common multiple is the smallest number that both factors go into. So we're trying to figure out, when you hear the word least, that means smallest. Common means both numbers have this in common, and multiple. So we're going to look at each of the numbers' multiples and find the one that they have in common. Okay? So I want you to consider this first example here, 12 and 18. So we're going to go through and we're going to list all of the multiples of each of those, and we're going to find the one that they have in common that's the smallest number. So what are the multiples of 12? So we did 12 times 1 is 12, 12 times 2 is 24, 12 times 3 is 36, 12 times 4 is 48, and we could keep going. Okay, but I'm going to stop and I want to list my multiples of 18 because maybe we have found something they have in common. So what are the multiples of 18? So 18 times 1 is 18. 18 times 2 is 36. And well, look there. If you see, we found a common multiple, and it's the smallest one they have in common. So our least common multiple is 36. Okay, so between 12 and 18, if we list all the multiples of both 12 and 18, the common multiple that is the least is 36. And this is going to help us with adding and subtracting fractions. Okay? So let's jump right into the steps of how to add and subtract positive and negative fractions. So our key question is how do I add and subtract fractions? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example. And as we work through this example, we're going to look through the steps to help us solve this. So I want you to consider the following example. So I'm going to give you the problem 3/4 plus -2 2/3. Okay? So we're going to go through the steps of how we would solve this problem. So the very first step, when I'm looking at my problem, the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look and see if I have any mixed numbers. And I'm going to convert all mixed numbers into improper fractions, if needed. Now, sometimes you don't have any mixed numbers, and so you don't have to do this step. But you always look and you say, do I have any mixed numbers? And if so, go ahead and convert them to improper fractions. Okay, so when I look at my example back over here, do I have any mixed numbers? I do. I have that 2 2/3. So I can rewrite the problem, and I can leave 3/4 just like it is because it's just a regular fraction. And I'm going to convert 2 2/3 to an improper. So I can multiply. 3 times 2 is 6. 6 plus 2 is 8. So I have 8/3, and I'm going to keep the negative with it. Okay, so now I have the same problem. I haven't changed anything. I've just converted the mixed number to an improper fraction. Okay? So first step, change all mixed numbers to improper. Step 2, you are going to then look at your fractions and you're going to find the least common denominator. Okay? So yesterday when you were multiplying, you could just multiply straight across. But with adding and subtracting fractions, you can't add and subtract straight across. You have to find a common denominator. We've got to get them to have the same whole as the denominator. Okay? So, step 2, find the least common denominator, or we can call that the LCM, okay? Which is what we talked about earlier. And that's that number that they have in common. So we're going to look here at our denominators, 4 and 3, okay? And we want to figure out what is the least common multiple between 4 and 3. So we can go through and list our multiples of 4, list our multiples of 3, and the number they have in common is 12. So we want to rewrite this fraction with 12 as my denominator, okay? So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to rewrite both of my fractions with 12 as the denominator. And so you can't just completely change the problem. We've got to make sure that it still equals the same thing, okay? So we need to say, well, what did I do to the 4 to get it to be 12? So what do you multiply 4 by to get it to be 12? So we said 4 times 3. So now our step 3 over here is now we're going to multiply the numerator by the same value that you multiply the denominator. So what did we multiply our denominator by there? We multiplied it by 3. So we're going to come here and we got to multiply our numerator by 3. So 3 times 3 is 9. Okay, because we need to make sure that both of them are the same amount of times bigger. Okay, so 9/12, and then I do the same thing for that second fraction. 3 times what gives me 12? 3 times 4. So I need to do the same thing to my numerator. So 8 times 4 is 32, and I'm going to keep the negative with it. Okay. So now let's go back to our steps. We converted the fraction mixed numbers to improper fractions. Step 2, we found the least common denominator, which was 12. And then whatever I multiplied the denominator by, I also had to multiply that numerator by. Okay? So now let's come down to step 4 that says we need to add using the same processes used when adding integers. Okay, so we're going to still use those same rules. Remember our rules, same signs, add, different signs, subtract, same sign, keep the sign, different, keep the larger. So we're going to look at our 2 fractions and we're going to decide if we're going to add or subtract. So the 9/12 doesn't have a sign in front, so that tells me it is positive. And then we have plus negative 32 over 12. So that sign is negative. Essentially, it's kind of like I have $9 and I spent 32. So since the signs are different, what am I going to do? I'm going to subtract. So I'm going to say 32 minus 9, and 32 minus 9 is 23. So now I'm going to have 23 over, and my next step is we want to keep the denominator the same. So what was my denominator? It was over 12, so I'm going to keep it. And then I've got to make sure I pay attention to my sign. So I'm going to go back up and I'm going to say, did I have more positives or more negatives? I have more negatives. So my answer is going to be negative 23 over 12. Okay? And then the final step is you always want to write the answer in simplest form. Okay? So that means we need to convert this improper fraction back to a mixed number. Okay? So we're going to ask ourselves, how many times does 12 go into 23? 1 time, and what do you have left over? 11 over 12. And my denominator stays the same, and I got to keep that negative. Okay? And just reiterating why it was negative. When I come back up here and I looked at my 2 numbers I was adding, there were more negatives there. So my answer was negative. Okay? So let's recap our steps. First thing when you solve a problem, you're going to look and see if you have any mixed numbers. If you have mixed numbers, you're going to change them to improper fractions. Step 2, you want to look and you want to find the least common denominator between those numbers you're adding. Okay, so you got that denominator needs to be the same. And when you change the denominator, whatever you multiply the denominator by, you also need to multiply the numerator. Step 4, you're going to just add using the same rules. Same signs add, different signs subtract, and then keep the denominator the same. And then the last step is we want to write our answer in simplest form. Okay, so we are going to go over more practice problems together when you come to our station. And right now, before we stop, I want you just to flip over, not you, but your paper. And we're just going to look at one more problem. Number 1, okay? And I'm not actually going to work this out, but I want you to start thinking through how you might solve it. So let's go through our steps. Do you see any mixed numbers? No, so we can keep that. Step 2, do they have the same denominator? No, so we would need to change the denominator. What would the common denominator be between those two? 12. And then step 3, whatever we change the numerator by, we also need to do the same to the numerator as we did to the denominator. And we're going to add using the same steps as integers. Okay, so we will pick up, if you want to go ahead and try that number 1 on your own. And then when you come to our station, we will continue there and we will go over any questions that you have. Okay, so if you have any questions, take a moment to write those down and we will be happy to answer them. So let's take a moment to go back up to our learning goals and make sure we have accomplished them. So our first learning goal said that we should be able to explain how to add and subtract fractions and mixed numbers. So right here. And we did that. We were able to add and subtract both positive and negative fractions and mixed numbers. And then our learning goal 2, we will do when we come to our station with the word problems, okay? So right now, just try that number 1 on the back and we will be happy to answer any questions you have. All right, good job, guys. Make me proud. Peace out, rainbow trout and speckled trout. Love you, mean it.